In the early months of 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy began receiving reports that seemed strange but not yet alarming. Merchant tankers traveling from the oil fields of Southeast Asia to the Japanese home islands were vanishing somewhere along the vast shipping routes of the Pacific. At first, the losses were small. One tanker failed to arrive in Yokohama. Another disappeared somewhere between Borneo and Formosa. The reports came from distant ports and remote shipping offices, written in calm, bureaucratic language. Ships delayed by weather, communication failure, possible mechanical trouble. For the admirals sitting inside the Navy Ministry in Tokyo, these incidents did not appear extraordinary. War often brought confusion to the oceans. Ships were lost every year to storms, accidents, or navigational mistakes. The Pacific was enormous, and it swallowed ships easily. But then something changed. Within a few months, the missing ships began to form a pattern. Tankers loaded with precious oil were disappearing along the same routes again and again. They were not sending distress signals. They were not drifting into neutral ports. They were simply gone. One Japanese shipping officer, studying the reports, noticed the same troubling detail repeated over and over. The ships had last been seen in waters where American submarines had recently been reported. At first, the suggestion seemed almost ridiculous. Before the war, Japanese naval strategy had never treated submarines as a serious threat to merchant shipping. The Imperial Navy believed the decisive battles of the war would take place between massive fleets of battleships and aircraft carriers. Submarines, in Japanese thinking, were tools for scouting or for attacking enemy warships, not for hunting slow cargo vessels. Merchant ships, especially oil tankers, were expected to travel across the Pacific with minimal protection. Escort ships were rare. Convoys were not yet common. Tankers often sailed alone across thousands of miles of open ocean. For the Japanese High Command, the real war was being fought somewhere else. They were focused on aircraft carrier battles in the Central Pacific, on island defenses stretching across the Solomon Islands, and on holding the vast territories Japan had captured during the early months of the war. Compared to those enormous strategic problems, the loss of a few merchant ships did not seem urgent, but the officers responsible for tracking shipping traffic began to grow uneasy. By late 1943, the reports arriving in Tokyo were becoming harder to dismiss. Tankers carrying millions of gallons of oil were vanishing without warning. Survivors from one destroyed vessel described torpedoes appearing suddenly out of the dark water. Another crew reported seeing the shadow of a submarine periscope moments before their ship exploded. Each new report told the same story. The attacks came without warning. The submarines were almost invisible, and the tankers, huge, slow ships carrying flammable fuel, were perfect targets. At sea, American submarines had begun to operate with increasing confidence. Many of them were stationed along the narrow shipping lanes connecting Japan to the oil-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies. These waters had become the lifeline of the Japanese Empire. Every barrel of oil that powered Japan's Navy, Army, and Air Force had to travel across those dangerous routes. American submarine commanders understood this perfectly. Instead of searching only for warships, they began hunting something even more valuable. They hunted the ships that carried the fuel. The strategy was simple but devastating. Submarines would wait quietly along the shipping lanes, often submerged during daylight hours and surfacing at night to track their targets. When a tanker appeared on the horizon, the submarine would move into position beneath the waves. Then the torpedoes would fire. For the crew of a tanker, the attack usually lasted only seconds. A violent explosion would rip open the side of the ship. Flames would burst from the fuel tanks within minutes. The vessel would be burning uncontrollably in the dark ocean, and by the time the survivors reached the water, the submarine had already vanished. Back in Tokyo, the Japanese admirals had not yet realized the true scale of what was happening. But far beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, a silent war had already begun. And that war was about to threaten the very survival of Japan's empires. For the leaders of Imperial Japan, oil was not simply another resource of war. It was the lifeblood of the entire empire. Every destroyer patrolling the Pacific, every aircraft taking off from island airfields, and every tank moving across Asian battlefields depended on a steady supply of fuel. Without oil, Japan's military power would simply stop moving. Unlike the United States, which possessed vast oil reserves within its own borders, Japan had entered the war with a dangerous weakness. The islands of Japan contained almost no natural petroleum. Before the war, Japan had imported most of its oil from the United States and other Western nations. But when the conflict in the Pacific began, those supplies were immediately cut off. The American embargo forced Japan to look elsewhere, and the answer lay thousands of miles away in the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia. The Dutch East Indies, particularly the islands around Borneo and Sumatra, possessed enormous oil fields that Japan desperately needed. Capturing those fields became one of the primary reasons Japan expanded southward at the beginning of the war. Once those regions fell under Japanese control, the empire suddenly possessed the fuel it required to continue fighting. But there was one enormous problem. The oil was far from Japan. Every drop of fuel had to be transported across the Pacific Ocean by tanker ships. These vessels became the arteries of the Japanese war machine. Long convoys of tankers carried crude oil and refined fuel from Southeast Asia through narrow sea routes toward Japan's home islands. The journey was long and dangerous, stretching across thousands of miles of open water. Yet during the early years of the war, these voyages were considered relatively safe. Japanese naval leaders believed their control of the Pacific would protect the shipping lanes. The empire's navy had expanded rapidly, capturing territory and pushing Allied forces back across the ocean. With American fleets damaged and many Allied bases destroyed, Japanese commanders assumed their merchant shipping would remain secure. Because of this confidence, Japan made a critical mistake. The protection of merchant shipping was never treated as a top priority. The Navy focused its attention on battleships, carriers, and major fleet engagements. Escort ships for tankers were limited. Convoy systems were poorly organized. Many merchant ships continued to sail alone across enormous distances of ocean. At first, the system seemed to work. Tankers arrived in Japanese ports carrying the fuel that powered aircraft factories, naval bases, and industrial plants. Oil storage facilities filled, and the Japanese war machine continued operating at full strength. Ships left the docks of Borneo and Balikpapan loaded with precious cargo, their steel tanks filled with the energy that fueled an empire at war. But beneath the surface of the Pacific, a new threat was beginning to emerge. American submarine commanders had carefully studied Japan's logistics network. They understood that Japan's strength depended on these long supply routes stretching across the ocean. Unlike the United States, Japan did not have unlimited industrial resources. Its war effort relied on maintaining a fragile supply chain connecting distant territories to the homeland. If that chain were broken, the entire military machine would begin to weaken. American naval planners realized something that Japanese admirals had not fully considered. Battleships and aircraft carriers were powerful weapons, but they were not the true foundation of Japan's power. The real foundation was oil. Without fuel, the carriers could not sail. Without fuel, the aircraft could not fly. Without fuel, even the largest battleship would become nothing more than a floating fortress trapped in port. American submarines began to position themselves along the shipping routes where the tankers traveled. These routes passed through narrow straits and predictable ocean corridors, making them ideal hunting grounds. The submarines waited patiently, often lying motionless beneath the waves while listening for the distant sound of ship engines traveling across the surface. When a tanker appeared, the submarine would begin a slow and careful approach, calculating speed, distance, and angle. The goal was not to attack quickly, but to strike with precision. A single torpedo hitting a tanker loaded with fuel could destroy the entire ship in seconds, and each tanker destroyed meant thousands of tons of oil that would never reach Japan. At first, the losses were small enough that Japanese commanders did not immediately recognize the danger. Ships were lost occasionally during wartime, and the vast Pacific Ocean made it difficult to track every vessel. But with each passing month, more tankers vanished along the same routes. The oil that once flowed steadily toward Japan was beginning to slow. Quietly, almost invisibly, American submarines had begun attacking the very lifeline of the Japanese Empire, and before long, the admirals in Tokyo would begin to realize that this silent campaign beneath the waves could threaten the entire war. Far beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, American submarines had begun transforming the nature of naval warfare. Unlike the massive battleships that dominated headlines and propaganda posters, submarines fought a quiet and invisible war. They did not appear in dramatic fleet engagements or decisive surface battles. Instead, they moved silently through the depths, striking without warning and disappearing before the enemy could react. For the crews aboard these submarines, the ocean was both their shield and their battlefield. Days were spent submerged beneath the waves, where the steel hull groaned under pressure, and the air inside the vessel slowly grew stale. Life inside a submarine was cramped, hot, and tense. Dozens of sailors lived in narrow compartments surrounded by machinery, torpedoes, and instruments that constantly monitored the ocean around them. There was little room to move and almost no privacy, yet these crews understood the importance of their mission. They had been sent to hunt the ships that kept Japan's war machine alive. American naval planners had begun to realize that the fastest way to weaken Japan was not by attacking its strongest warships, but by targeting its supply lines. Tankers carrying oil were among the most valuable targets on the ocean. A single tanker could carry thousands of tons of fuel, enough to power aircraft, ships, and vehicles across the entire Pacific theater. Destroying one tanker meant removing enormous quantities of fuel from Japan's shrinking reserves. Submarine commanders began to patrol the narrow sea lanes connecting the oil fields of Southeast Asia to the Japanese home islands. These shipping routes passed through predictable areas where merchant vessels were forced to travel. Straits between islands, narrow channels, and common navigation paths became perfect hunting grounds. From beneath the water, submarines would wait patiently for hours, sometimes days, listening through sensitive hydrophones that could detect the distant hum of ship engines traveling across the ocean surface. When the sound of a tanker appeared, the submarine crew would move quickly into action. The captain studied the instruments carefully, estimating the speed and direction of the target. Officers calculated the correct firing angle while the torpedo crew prepared the weapons. Everything depended on timing and precision. A mistake of only a few degrees could cause the torpedo to miss entirely. Once the submarine reached the correct position, the captain would give the order. Compressed air would launch the torpedo from its tube, sending it racing through the dark water toward the unsuspecting ship. For the crew of the tanker above, the attack usually arrived without warning. One moment the ocean appeared calm and empty. The next moment, a violent explosion tore through the side of the ship as the torpedo struck its hull. When a tanker carrying fuel was hit, the results were often catastrophic. Oil spilled across the water and ignited instantly, turning the sea itself into a burning field of fire. Flames could rise dozens of meters into the air as the ship's cargo erupted into an inferno. Sailors rushed desperately toward lifeboats, while thick black smoke filled the sky. In many cases, the vessel sank within minutes. Beneath the surface, the submarine crew listened as the sounds of destruction echoed through the water. Once the torpedo struck its target, the captain rarely remained in the area for long. Destroyers or patrol aircraft could arrive quickly, and submarines were extremely vulnerable if discovered. After confirming the hit, the submarine would dive deeper and quietly slip away into the vast darkness of the ocean. These attacks began occurring with increasing frequency throughout 1943 and 1944. Tankers that had once crossed the Pacific with little danger were now entering waters where invisible predators waited beneath them. American submarines had begun operating in coordinated patrol zones, ensuring that important shipping routes remained constantly under threat. For Japanese merchant sailors, the ocean was becoming a place of growing fear. Every voyage across the Pacific carried the risk that a submarine might be watching from below. Yet, inside the Japanese Naval Command, many admirals still underestimated the danger. Submarines were considered troublesome, but not decisive. The real war, they believed, would still be determined by powerful fleets and massive naval battles. What they had not yet fully understood was that the submarines were not merely sinking ships. They were slowly draining the fuel that powered Japan's entire military. And with every tanker sent to the bottom of the Pacific, the Empire's ability to continue the war was quietly slipping away. Inside the grand offices of the Imperial Japanese Navy in Tokyo, the war was viewed through a very different lens than it was in the dark depths of the Pacific. The admirals responsible for directing Japan's naval strategy had spent their entire careers studying one idea above all others: the decisive fleet battle. For decades, Japanese naval doctrine had been built around the belief that wars at sea were ultimately decided by massive confrontations between powerful surface fleets. Battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers were the instruments of victory. These great warships would meet the enemy in a single dramatic engagement, destroying the opposing fleet and securing control of the ocean. In this vision of naval warfare, submarines were considered useful but secondary weapons. Their primary role was expected to be scouting for the main fleet or attacking enemy warships after a battle had already begun. Very few Japanese naval planners believed submarines could become the main force capable of determining the outcome of a war. Because of this mindset, merchant shipping had never received the level of protection it truly required. Japan possessed a large merchant fleet responsible for transporting food, raw materials, weapons, and oil across the empire. Yet the Navy did not allocate many warships to escort these vessels. Protecting merchant convoys was viewed as a defensive and somewhat unglamorous task compared to preparing for great naval battles. Tankers loaded with oil continued to sail across the Pacific largely unprotected. Some ships traveled in small groups, but many still sailed alone along predictable routes. Escort destroyers were often assigned to combat fleets instead of guarding slow cargo ships. In the early years of the war, this strategy did not appear to cause serious problems. Japan's rapid victories in Southeast Asia and the Pacific gave the impression that the empire controlled the surrounding seas. Allied naval forces had suffered heavy losses, and American fleets were still rebuilding after the early months of the conflict. With this apparent dominance, Japanese admirals believed their shipping lanes were relatively secure. When reports of lost tankers began arriving, they were initially interpreted as isolated incidents rather than signs of a coordinated campaign. War always brought losses at sea. Ships could disappear for many reasons. Storms, accidents, navigational errors, and occasional submarine encounters were all considered normal risks during wartime. As long as most tankers continued reaching Japanese ports, the Navy saw little reason to reorganize its strategy. Even when intelligence reports suggested that American submarines were becoming more active along certain shipping routes, many Japanese commanders remained unconvinced that the threat was serious. Submarines, they believed, could sink a few ships, but could never cripple the empire's logistic system. The real danger, in their view, would come from massive carrier strikes or large surface fleets. Meanwhile, the American submarine force was quietly becoming more effective. Earlier in the war, U.S. submarines had struggled with serious technical problems. Many torpedoes failed to detonate properly or ran at incorrect depths. These issues caused frustration among submarine commanders who watched their weapons strike targets without exploding. But by 1943, these problems had largely been corrected. American torpedoes were becoming far more reliable, and submarine crews had gained valuable experience from months of patrols across the Pacific. With improved weapons and better tactics, submarine commanders began sinking ships at a steadily increasing rate. Tankers, cargo ships, and transport vessels were all vulnerable targets. Each successful patrol meant fewer supplies reaching Japan's ports. Yet in Tokyo, the scale of the problem was still not fully understood. Reports of ship losses were scattered across different departments and often delayed by weeks or months. No single office was initially responsible for analyzing the full pattern of shipping destruction. Because of this fragmented information, The growing submarine campaign did not immediately appear as the strategic threat it truly was. Some officers within the Navy did begin raising concerns. They warned that the loss of oil tankers could eventually create serious fuel shortages. They suggested expanding convoy systems and assigning more escort ships to protect merchant traffic. But changing naval doctrine was difficult. Japan had invested enormous resources into building a powerful battle fleet, and many admirals believed those ships would still decide the war. In their minds, submarines remained an annoyance rather than a decisive weapon. What they had not yet realized was that the war in the Pacific was no longer being fought only by fleets and aircraft carriers. Beneath the waves, a quieter but far more dangerous campaign was unfolding. And every week that passed without stronger protection for the tanker routes allowed American submarines to tighten their grip on Japan's most vital supply lines. By the middle of 1944, the situation facing Japan's merchant fleet had changed dramatically. What had once appeared to be scattered losses at sea was now becoming an undeniable pattern of destruction. Reports arriving in Tokyo described tankers and cargo ships disappearing in growing numbers along nearly every major shipping route connecting Southeast Asia to the Japanese home islands. The statistics, once examined together, began to reveal a frightening reality. American submarines were sinking Japanese shipping faster than it could be replaced. For years before the war, Japan had invested heavily in building a large merchant fleet to supply its expanding empire. Thousands of vessels carried food, oil, metals, rubber, and other vital resources across the Pacific and throughout Asia. These ships formed the backbone of Japan's logistics network. Without them, the entire military machine would grind to a halt. Now, those ships were vanishing at an accelerating pace. Every month brought new losses. Tankers carrying crude oil from Borneo and Sumatra were among the most frequent victims. These ships were large, slow, and heavily loaded with fuel, making them easy targets for submarines waiting along the sea lanes. When a torpedo struck a tanker, the results were often devastating. The explosion could ignite thousands of tons of oil, turning the entire vessel into a floating inferno within seconds. Survivors described towering flames and thick black smoke rising high above the ocean as their ships burned uncontrollably. Many tankers sank so quickly that there was little time for the crew to escape. For the American submarine commanders conducting these attacks, the results of their campaign were becoming increasingly clear. Patrol reports described long columns of smoke visible on the horizon after successful torpedo strikes. Each destroyed ship represented thousands of barrels of oil that would never reach Japan's ports. Submarine crews carefully documented the tonnage of every vessel they sank. These numbers were sent back to American Naval Headquarters, where analysts began measuring the growing impact of the submarine campaign. What they discovered was remarkable. American submarines, representing only a small portion of the U.S. Navy's total fleet, were responsible for destroying a massive percentage of Japan's merchant shipping. Cargo ships, troop transports, and oil tankers were all falling victim to the silent hunters beneath the waves. By late 1944, the losses had become impossible for Japanese leaders to ignore. Entire convoys were disappearing. Ships that once traveled regularly between Southeast Asia and Japan were no longer arriving at their destinations Oil shipments that had previously flowed steadily toward Japanese refineries were beginning to decline sharply. The numbers told a terrifying story. Japan was losing ships far faster than its shipyards could build replacements. Even worse, the tankers that carried oil were among the most difficult vessels to replace. These ships required specialized construction and materials that were becoming increasingly scarce as the war continued. With each tanker sunk by a submarine torpedo, Japan's ability to transport fuel across the Pacific weakened further. Fuel shortages began appearing in unexpected places. Naval bases reported reduced supplies. Aircraft training flights were quietly limited to conserve fuel. Industrial facilities dependent on oil began operating under stricter rationing. At first, these shortages seemed temporary, but as the months passed, they became more severe. Japanese commanders slowly began realizing that the submarine campaign was attacking something far more important than individual ships. It was attacking the entire logistical foundation of Japan's war effort. The empire's vast territory stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, and maintaining control over those territories required constant shipments of fuel and supplies. Without reliable shipping routes, Japan could not sustain its military presence across the Pacific. American submarines had discovered the empire's greatest vulnerability. They were not simply sinking ships, they were severing the supply lines that connected Japan to the resources it needed to fight. And as the losses continued to mount, even the most confident admirals in Tokyo began to understand that something far more dangerous than occasional submarine attacks was happening in the Pacific. The silent war beneath the waves was turning into a strategic disaster. By late 1944, the consequences of the submarine campaign were no longer hidden inside shipping reports or scattered naval documents. The effects were beginning to appear across the entire Japanese war machine. What had started as a series of unexplained tanker losses was now turning into a national crisis. Fuel, the most critical resource for modern warfare, was becoming dangerously scarce. For Japan's Navy, the shortage was devastating. Warships that once roamed freely across the Pacific were suddenly forced to remain in port for long periods of time. Battleships that had been designed to dominate the oceans now sat motionless at anchor, their massive engines silent because there was not enough fuel to operate them regularly. Even aircraft carriers, the most valuable ships in Japan's fleet, faced growing limitations on their movements. Naval commanders had to carefully ration every drop of fuel that remained in storage tanks. Training exercises for pilots and sailors were reduced drastically. Ships that once conducted regular patrols now sailed only when absolutely necessary. The Japanese Navy had been built to fight a powerful and mobile war across the Pacific, but without fuel, its ability to move was slowly disappearing. The Japanese Air Force faced similar problems. Aircraft required large amounts of fuel not only for combat missions, but also for training new pilots. Before the war, pilots had spent hundreds of hours practicing flight maneuvers, navigation, and combat tactics. Now the situation had changed. With fuel supplies shrinking, training programs were cut back severely. Young pilots were sometimes sent into combat with far fewer hours of experience than their predecessors. The shortage of oil was quietly weakening the quality of Japan's air forces. Even Japan's industrial production began to feel the pressure. Factories that produced weapons, vehicles, and aircraft relied on oil both as fuel and as a key industrial resource. As shipments from Southeast Asia declined, Factory managers were forced to operate under strict fuel limitations. Production schedules slowed, and some facilities struggled to maintain their previous levels of output. The war economy of Japan was beginning to strain under the weight of the submarine blockade. What made the situation especially dangerous for Japan was the geographic reality of the empire. Unlike countries that possessed natural resources within their own borders, Japan depended almost entirely on materials transported from distant territories. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Southeast Asia, metals from occupied regions, all of these resources had to travel across thousands of miles of ocean before reaching the factories and bases of the Japanese homeland. The shipping lanes that connected these territories were now filled with American submarines. Each patrol placed another invisible barrier between Japan and the resources it desperately needed. Submarine commanders had learned to position their vessels along narrow straits and choke points where merchant ships were forced to pass. The Luzon Strait, the South China Sea, and the waters surrounding Taiwan became dangerous corridors where submarines waited patiently for targets. Merchant sailors began describing these routes as deadly traps. Every voyage carried the possibility that a torpedo might suddenly strike from beneath the waves. Some ships attempted to travel at night or take longer, less predictable routes, but the submarines continued finding them. The Pacific Ocean was vast, yet the number of safe shipping routes was limited. For the Japanese Navy, the realization was deeply troubling. The Empire's strategy had always assumed that control of major naval forces would secure the seas. Battleships and aircraft carriers had been seen as the ultimate tools of maritime dominance. But American submarines were proving that a much smaller and quieter force could threaten the Empire's survival. One by one, the ships carrying Japan's precious oil reserves were being hunted down and destroyed. The admirals in Tokyo were beginning to see a terrifying possibility. If the submarines continued sinking tankers at the current rate, the flow of oil to Japan could eventually stop altogether. Without fuel, ships would remain trapped in harbor. Aircraft would sit idle on airfields. Tanks and vehicles would run out of gasoline. The empire that had expanded rapidly across Asia and the Pacific might find itself unable to move its own military forces. The submarine war had become something far more dangerous than the Japanese Navy had imagined. It was no longer just a threat to individual ships. It had become a strategic nightmare that threatened the very foundation of Japan's ability to wage war. By early 1945, the reality confronting Japan's naval leadership could no longer be ignored or explained away. The losses were no longer isolated incidents or unfortunate accidents at sea. They had become a clear and devastating pattern. Tankers, cargo ships, and transport vessels were being destroyed across nearly every major route that connected the empire's distant territories to the Japanese homeland. For the first time since the beginning of the war, senior admirals began examining the full scale of the disaster. Reports from shipping offices, naval intelligence, and merchant fleet registries were brought together and studied as a single picture. What the numbers revealed was deeply alarming. American submarines had sunk an enormous portion of Japan's merchant fleet. Entire categories of ships had nearly vanished from the oceans. Oil tankers were among the hardest hit, and these vessels were the very ships that carried the fuel required to sustain Japan's military forces. When Japanese naval planners calculated how much oil was still reaching the home islands, the results were shocking. Shipments from Southeast Asia had dropped dramatically compared to earlier years of the war. The once steady flow of fuel had been reduced to a trickle. The Empire's lifeline was collapsing. Admirals who had once dismissed submarines as minor threats were now forced to confront a different reality. The American submarine fleet had become one of the most effective weapons in the entire Pacific War. It was operating far from major naval battles, quietly striking the logistical system that supported Japan's entire military structure. Every torpedo that struck a tanker removed not only a ship, but also the precious oil it carried. This realization changed how some Japanese commanders began thinking about the war itself. They understood that the United States was fighting on multiple levels at once. American aircraft carriers and naval fleets were challenging Japan's forces directly in battle. But at the same time, submarines were conducting a separate campaign designed to weaken the empire from within. It was a strategy aimed not just at destroying enemy ships, but at starving the Japanese war machine of the resources it required to survive. The more the admiral studied the shipping reports, the clearer the pattern became. American submarines had carefully targeted the vessels that mattered most. Oil tankers, supply ships, and transport vessels were all being hunted with increasing precision. The attacks were not random. They were part of a deliberate effort to choke the Empire's supply lines. Even more troubling was the growing skill of the submarine crews. Early in the war, many American torpedoes had malfunctioned or failed to detonate properly. Japanese ships had sometimes escaped serious damage simply because the enemy's weapons did not work as intended. But by 1944 and 1945, those problems had largely been solved. Submarines were now striking with far greater accuracy and reliability. Patrol reports indicated that American commanders had become extremely effective at locating and destroying merchant ships. The oceans surrounding Japan were no longer safe. For Japanese merchant sailors, every voyage had become a gamble. Ships sailed under constant threat, knowing that a submarine might be waiting along their route. Even with escorts, tankers remained vulnerable because they were slow and difficult to defend. A single successful torpedo strike could destroy an entire vessel in moments. Some admirals began advocating urgent changes to protect what remained of Japan's shipping capacity. They called for stronger convoy systems, more escort ships, and better anti-submarine patrols. But implementing these changes was far easier to suggest than to accomplish. By this stage of the war, Japan was already facing severe shortages of ships, aircraft, fuel, and trained personnel. The resources needed to defend the shipping lanes effectively were simply not available in sufficient numbers. The Empire was now fighting a defensive war across multiple fronts, and every available ship was needed elsewhere. As the scale of the submarine campaign became clearer, the realization slowly spread through Japan's naval command. The war was no longer being decided only in dramatic fleet battles or aerial dogfights above distant islands. It was also being fought in the silent depths of the ocean, where submarines hunted the ships that carried the Empire's lifeblood. And by the time the admirals fully understood what was happening beneath the waves, the damage to Japan's supply system had already become catastrophic. Once the scale of the disaster became clear, Japanese leaders finally attempted to respond. Plans were drawn up to strengthen the protection of merchant shipping. and the Navy began reorganizing how tankers and cargo vessels traveled across the Pacific. The idea was simple in theory. Instead of allowing ships to sail alone, they would travel together in convoys guarded by warships capable of detecting and attacking submarines. Escort destroyers would patrol around the merchant vessels, watching for periscopes and listening for submarines beneath the water. Patrol aircraft would search the sea routes ahead of the convoys, hoping to spot submarines before they could attack. Convoys had already proven effective in the Atlantic Ocean, where Allied shipping faced constant threats from German U-boats. Japanese commanders hoped the same system might help protect their own supply lines. But the problem Japan faced in 1944 and 1945 was that the empire no longer possessed the resources necessary to implement such a system effectively. Escort ships were in short supply. Many destroyers had already been lost in previous naval battles across the Pacific. Others were tied up protecting military fleets or defending key bases. There simply were not enough warships available to guard every convoy traveling between Southeast Asia and Japan. The situation was made even worse by the shortage of fuel. Escort ships themselves required large amounts of oil to operate, and the very problem Japan was trying to solve, losing oil shipments, was limiting its ability to deploy the ships needed to protect those shipments. In some cases, destroyers assigned to convoy duty had to reduce their patrols or remain in port simply because fuel reserves were too low. Patrol aircraft faced similar difficulties. Anti-submarine warfare depended heavily on aircraft capable of scanning large areas of ocean and attacking submarines when they surfaced. But Japan's air forces were already stretched thin defending territory and fighting American aircraft in the skies above the Pacific Islands. Aircraft assigned to convoy protection often had limited fuel and limited training. Many pilots lacked the experience needed to track submarines effectively. Meanwhile, American submarines continued refining their tactics. Submarine commanders studied Japanese convoy patterns and learned how to intercept them along predictable routes. When convoys appeared, submarines sometimes attacked from multiple directions, firing torpedoes before diving deep beneath the surface to avoid escort ships. Even when escorts attempted to hunt the submarines with depth charges, the attackers frequently slipped away. In the vast depths of the Pacific, the ocean was enormous, and a submarine that successfully escaped the first attack could disappear into the darkness below. The balance of the conflict was increasingly shifting in favor of the submarines. American shipyards were producing new submarines at a steady pace, while Japan struggled to replace the merchant ships it had already lost. Each month, the gap widened. Fewer Japanese ships were sailing, and more American submarines were waiting to intercept them. Some Japanese tankers attempted desperate measures to avoid detection. They sailed at night, changed routes, or traveled close to coastlines where submarines might have difficulty maneuvering. But these tactics offered only limited protection. Submarines adapted quickly, positioning themselves along new routes and continuing their relentless campaign against Japan's shipping lanes. The losses continued. Tankers that managed to reach Japan often arrived damaged or carrying smaller amounts of fuel because shipping routes had become so dangerous. Each shipment represented a risk that many sailors knew they might not survive. Crews boarded these vessels with the knowledge that their ships were prime targets for invisible enemies beneath the sea. Inside the Japanese Naval Command, The situation had become painfully clear. The submarine campaign had grown into a crisis that the Empire no longer possessed the power to reverse. Too many ships had already been sunk. Too many supply routes had already been disrupted. Even if new convoy systems were introduced, there were not enough escorts, aircraft, or fuel to defend the entire network of shipping lanes. The realization was difficult to accept. The empire that had once expanded rapidly across Asia now found itself unable to protect the very ships that kept its war machine alive. The submarines hunting beneath the Pacific had achieved something no single fleet battle had accomplished. They had slowly and systematically weakened the logistical foundation of Japan's power. And by the time Japan attempted to fix the problem, the damage had already been done. By the final months of the war, the silent campaign beneath the Pacific Ocean had achieved something extraordinary. The American submarine force, though relatively small compared to the massive fleets fighting across the Pacific, had inflicted catastrophic damage on Japan's ability to sustain its war effort. Ship after ship had been sent to the bottom of the ocean, and the Empire's merchant fleet had been devastated. When historians later examined the numbers, the results were staggering. American submarines were responsible for sinking thousands of Japanese vessels during the war, including cargo ships, troop transports, and a large percentage of Japan's precious oil tankers. Though submarines made up only a small part of the U.S. Navy's total strength, they accounted for a majority of Japan's shipping losses. The consequences of those losses were felt across the entire Japanese military. Naval fleets that once moved confidently across the Pacific were now limited by fuel shortages. Aircraft that once filled the skies above island bases were grounded because there was not enough oil for training or combat missions. Armies stationed across distant territories found their supply lines shrinking as fewer transport ships managed to reach them. The empire that had once expanded rapidly across Asia and the Pacific was now struggling simply to maintain the forces it already had. What made the submarine campaign so effective was its focus on logistics rather than direct combat. Battles between fleets were dramatic and often decisive, but they were also rare. The destruction of supply lines, on the other hand, happened constantly and relentlessly. Every merchant ship sunk represented a loss of materials, fuel, and equipment that Japan could not easily replace. In many ways, the submarine war was a campaign of attrition, slowly draining the resources that kept the empire functioning. American submarine commanders understood this strategy well. Instead of searching only for enemy warships, they concentrated on targets that would have the greatest long-term impact on Japan's ability to fight. Oil tankers, supply ships, and transport vessels became their primary objectives. By attacking these targets repeatedly, submarines gradually weakened the entire structure supporting Japan's military operations. For the sailors who served aboard the submarines, the war was fought far from public attention. Their missions were often long and dangerous, taking them deep into enemy-controlled waters where rescue would be unlikely if their vessel were damaged or sunk. Submarines themselves were fragile machines compared to large warships. A single depth charge placed correctly by an enemy destroyer could destroy the entire submarine and everyone aboard. Yet, despite these risks, submarine crews continued returning to sea patrol after patrol, carrying out the quiet work of hunting merchant shipping. Their successes were not always visible in dramatic headlines, but the results were steadily reshaping the course of the war. By the time the conflict approached its final stages, The Japanese Empire faced a situation that few of its early war planners had imagined. It still possessed soldiers, ships, and aircraft, but many of these forces lacked the fuel and supplies required to operate effectively. The Empire's logistical network, the system that transported resources across thousands of miles of ocean, had been severely crippled. The realization that Japanese admirals eventually reached was both simple and devastating. Control of the sea did not depend only on powerful fleets or massive naval battles. It also depended on the ability to move resources safely across the ocean. Once that ability was lost, even the strongest military forces would struggle to continue fighting. The war beneath the waves had revealed a new truth about modern conflict. Silent hunters operating far from the spotlight of great battles could change the course of a war simply by attacking the lifelines that sustained an enemy nation. And by the end of World War II, the submarines patrolling the Pacific had done exactly that. They had quietly severed the arteries of an empire, proving that sometimes the most decisive victories are achieved not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient and relentless pressure in the unseen depths of the ocean.